Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really glad to have with me once again Jim Rogers, who really needs no introduction to this audience, has a very successful TV personality of his own in the past at CNBC and elsewhere. World traveler, a well-known author. He's been on this show before, so welcome, Jim. It's really good to have you with us again.
I'm delighted to be back, Jay.
Really good to talk to you for your insights as a world traveler, especially. I'd like to focus today. Before we get into that, though, I'd like to just ask you, how are you enjoying your life in Singapore with your wife, Paige, and I believe you have 2 children now?
Yes, 2 daughters, 2 young daughters, Happy and Baby B. Oh, we're all very keen. When I left New York, at the last minute, the last day or a few days, I almost backed out and didn't sell my house. Now I'm delighted I did. Singapore is a wonderful place to live with great education, great health care. Everything works in Singapore, Jay. It's not like New York where nothing works. No, it's a great place to live.
Yeah, so I guess that you sort of answered my second question. I was going to ask you, it's been how many years since you moved there?
7.5.
7.5 years. So, I mean, things do change in 7.5 years. I take it then that you're very pleased with that decision. And if you had to do it over again, you would have. I mean, you don't have any regrets now. So that's what I hear you saying.
No regrets. No regrets. No, we're very pleased to be here.
Very good. Well, I would like to focus a little bit today on growing tensions between NATO and Russia. I think you having traveled extensensively in Russia, not once but twice, and maybe more than that, but the 2 that I know of, your world tours, took you with considerable time through Russia. In late winter 1990, I believe, was the first time that you traveled there or thereabouts when you started out on your first worldwide trip, 65,000 miles on a motorcycle around the world. You visited 6 continents. Then I guess the latest one was around the start of 1999, January 1st, I believe, when you started out from Europe, or I believe you started out from Reykjavik, and you started on another tour, this time not alone, but with Paige Parker, who would soon become your wife, and you, that not on a motorcycle either, but with a custom-made Mercedes-Benz. On both trips, as I say, you spent quite a bit of time in Russia. And with Russia very much in the news these days, I really do want to hear sort of your impression of what might be going on there and elsewhere and around the world, and why we're running into the trouble we seem to be having now. 25 years ago, almost, since you first visited there, what changes did you observe in Russia between your first visit and your second visit? And then I know that you've traveled to Moscow, at least more recently. Would like to know how you see that country now compared to when you first visited back in 1990?
Well, Jay, first of all, you said I spent a lot of time. Yes, if you drive across Russia, you have to spend a lot of time. It's a huge country.
Yeah.
And both times I drove across, the infrastructure was lacking, to say the least. So even if you just could go as fast as you could, it took a long time. Many stretches, there were hardly any roads at all. But just a little more background. I first went to Russia in 1966. I went behind the Soviet Union. I was part of I was a student as part of a university trip. And I came away saying, boy, this is not going to work. And I was bearish on Russia for the next 46 years. My 2 trips that you mentioned, where I drove across Russia, the first time was from the Pacific Ocean to Poland, and the second time was from the Pacific Ocean to Finland. And both those times confirmed my view that this is not going to work. It's going to be a big mess. And as you know, Soviet Union was a big mess, and then Russia after that. But and there was very little change. For the second time, 1999, by then, of course, communism had failed. The Soviet Union had broken up. Russia was alone. It didn't dominate these other nations anymore. Other than that, I mean, there weren't many changes. You still had trouble finding a place to sleep. You still had bad roads. It was easier to buy things in 1999 than it was in 1990. Certainly there were some things in the shops. There were restaurants the second time, but still it was a undeveloped, if even developed was a proper word, even undeveloped was a proper word. So things were bad, and I didn't see any prospect of them getting better. I was pessimistic about communism and its aftermath and the way things were run, the bureaucracy, the work ethic, everything, just everything about Russia. It was not going to work. But in the last couple of years, I've become more optimistic because I have seen changes in the Kremlin. Somebody realizes they cannot do the same old stuff, just take people's money or put them in jail or execute them or whatever, that you have to, if you're going to develop an economy and a society, you have to respect the laws of mankind.
Yeah.
You know, you gotta, if people invent something or if people build a company, you can't just take it away from them or shoot them. So there's been a change. And so I've started getting more optimistic on Russia after 46 years of being pessimistic. Then, to quickly update, along came Ukraine, which has thrown a fly in the ointment. As you know, I'm an American, as are you and your listeners, I presume, but, you know, America started trying to overthrow the Ukraine. I mean, it's all on tape. There's plenty of evidence that this is what happened. America tried to do that in many cases, as you well know.
Yes.
And so we started trying to overthrow the Ukraine, and it backfired. You know, unfortunately, Putin outsmarted us, and so now America's blaming it on Russia, like Russia did something wrong in Ukraine. And so we have problems internationally and with sanctions against Russia. I'm very much against very few sanctions any time in history against anybody have ever worked or had any effect. These are a little absurd. They're hurting America in the long run more than they're hurting Russia, because Russia's just turning to Asia, and Asia's got a lot more money and a lot more people, a lot bigger markets than does the U.S. and Europe at this point. So unfortunately, now Russia and Asia are getting closer and closer together. It's hurting some people for a short time, but in the end, it's going to hurt us, America, more than it's hurting Russia. And Russia's suffering at the moment, not so much from sanctions, but from the collapse of oil prices. That, too, was engineered in Washington. You know, if you go back and look at what's happened in the last several months, America was negotiating with Iran to try to solve the problems we have with them and they with us. And then in July, or June, I guess it was, the negotiations fell apart and the deadline was about to pass. And so America and Iran agreed to wait 7 months to set up a new deadline, which was 7 months. Well, almost instantly, oil prices started collapsing because Saudi Arabia started dumping oil at that point, because America told them to dump oil to put pressure on Iran since the 7 month period, since the first deadline had passed. And we hoped that the second deadline, 7 months later, they would listen to us. We were also putting pressure on Russia. And Saudi Arabia, of course, was happy to start dumping oil because they have the fear of fracking, that fracking might hurt oil forever, for long periods of time. So you had the Saudis starting to dump oil to help America with Iran and with Russia. It certainly worked, as you know. Oil prices are down nearly 50%, if not 50%, in that period of time. And so Russia's not a great place right now. The currency's collapsing. I continue to look for investments in Russia. I don't have very much yet. I even became a director of a company, a large Russian fertilizer company, in September. So I don't have much yet, but I am looking to buy more. You know as well as anybody else that when things are collapsing, you should be looking that way, not running away. So I am looking to increase my investment in Russia.
Jim, how do you think it's probably impacting Europe to a great extent, too, these sanctions against Russia? Is it not?
Oh, yes. Some European companies were badly hit. Europe, by the way, most of Europe is now trying to figure out a way to get around the sanctions, and many of them are. Some of them are doing business with Belarus, which is the neighbor of Russia, and then the goods get shipped into Russia. So they're finding ways around the sanctions. Most Europeans don't particularly like the sanctions any more than anybody else does. But yes, it certainly has had and is having an effect in Europe as well. But again, from Europe's point of view, the same thing. It's driving Russia to Asia, which in the long run is not good for Europe.
Yeah, you make the point about sanctions very seldom working. In fact, President Obama made that point when he talked about Cuba. When he announced he was going to open up relations with Cuba, he says we've had these sanctions on for 30 years or whatever, and they haven't worked. The following day, he turns around and signs a bill that increases sanctions against Russia. So it's sort of curious. But I want to ask you about Cuba. Opening relations with Cuba at this point in time, I have to think it might be a little bit of geopolitics involved there, a little tit for tat perhaps, with the Ukraine, with Russia doing with the Ukraine what they're doing, and Cuba, of course, being sort of just recently Putin, I think, had agreed to increase trade and relations with Cuba, maybe before the latest of the Ukrainian issues popped up. But, of course, Cuba is sort of in touch with other countries that are considered rogue nations by the United States, and such as Venezuela. I suppose Bolivia might fit in there, and to a certain extent Ecuador. But I'm just wondering if you think maybe there's some geopolitics going on. I like the idea of being able to trade with various nations. I think that's what we should do. I think you probably agree with that too, that we shouldn't be restricted in our trade with various countries. We should be free to trade. But do you have any thoughts about that? Do you think this might have been a little bit of geopolitics involved with opening up to Cuba at this point in time?
Well, I'm sure of that. It's not going to help or hurt Russia very much. Cuba's only got 10 million people, Jay, so we're not talking about a gigantic, it's a very small, tiny economy. But, of course, it's just another slap in the face to Russia that, okay, now we're going to get involved more with your friends in Cuba. But back to the bigger point, it's another example of how sanctions, here we've had sanctions on Cuba for over 50 years, and it's done nothing to change anything in Cuba. If anything, it's held Cuba back. I'm of the view that the more relationships you have with people, the more likely you are to change them. If Cubans get exposed to prosperity and capitalism and good times and smart people, they're more likely to be involved with them than if you're sitting there hitting them over the head day after day after day.
Mm-hmm.
So, no, it's obviously, in my view, not a good thing. Certainly didn't work in South Africa. South Africa changed on its own, and we could go on and on. And I've suspected, yes, Obama said, well, I'll give him another slap in the face by opening up Cuba. But I think, listen, Jay, after over 50 years of failure, you think even Obama, even the politicians in Washington will realize this didn't work. Maybe we should try something new.
Well, the definition of insanity doesn't seem to be observed by the Federal Reserve, the banking system, or our government. I think it was, I don't know who it was that decided or defined insanity as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So that seems to be what our policymakers are doing, and one wonders sometimes if they don't have, what their motives are. I don't, it's hard to believe that they're that stupid, but anyway, that's,
it's not hard for me to believe they're that stupid. I'm older than you. I've seen them.
You're not that much older than You're not that much.
They're that stupid.
Yeah, I just, these are guys that come out of top institutions in many cases at the Federal Reserve. They've all been propagandized, I suppose. I mean, PhDs from Princeton, Harvard, and Yale. How can they be stupid? But I guess maybe anyway. One of the things I noticed in your book, your Adventure Capitalist, which, by the way, to my listeners, I really recommend, if you haven't read it, pick up a copy of it. It's a real fun read, and I think it's an educational read. Most of us can't travel the way Jim Rogers has a couple of times around the world and still does travel frequently all over the place. But if you want to get a real sense of what life was like, and this was, now it's 15 years ago almost, isn't it, Jim? I mean, we're talking about it. Time goes so fast. I would really recommend to my listeners that they pick up a copy of Adventure Capitalist. It's just a great read. It's a lot of fun. I was because I'm so focused on Russia, and I went and looked at parts that you wrote about that. And one of the things that struck me, Jim, was that on page 161 of your book, there is a picture of you with Father Valentin. He's a Russian Orthodox priest who was a dissident, an outcast priest when you visited Russia the first time. On your second trip, Well, he was given a considerable amount of power, and one of the criticisms. I mean, we in the United States, they criticize Putin for everything. One of the things they're criticizing him for is being too cozy with the Russian Orthodox Church and being too moralistic. And the Russians have, I mean, he came out against the punk rock group Pussy Riot. He came out and they put, they've come out against homosexuality and stuff like that. That used to be at one time those kind of ideas were not accepted that widely in the United States either. But in any event, not to moralize. But I'm wondering, do you have any concerns about Putin being too close to the Russian Orthodox Church?
No, that Russia's too big and there are too many people. I mean, is Obama too close to the church in the States, or the people in the Great Britain too close to the church? No, I don't. Yes, he's not like Khrushchev. He's not like Stalin. He's not like Lenin. But
yeah.
No, and certainly that he listens to the church, and the church has an influence on all Russians, especially Russian politicians. But as far as being too close, no, that doesn't disturb me at the moment.
Yeah, well, it would seem as though, from what I'm reading, there is a great deal of religious freedom there. The Catholic Church and a lot of Protestant churches and some non-Judeo-Christian synagogues and so forth. At least the freedom to worship in Russia is one of the things that I picked up on, not only from your book, but also from some other sources that I've looked at. And to me, as a person who was brought up in this country, I thought that was one of the things that America was supposed to be about. But in a sort of very subtle way, we are being trained to think a certain way about a lot of things, Jim, I think. And one of the things I really appreciate about you is your ability to provide an objective point of view, not only because, well, I think you moved to Singapore because you had a mindset that sees the world objectively more than most of us are capable of doing. So that's one of the reasons I really wanted to talk to you. I'd also like to ask you a little bit about the BRICS. You mentioned the relationship between Russia and China. Well, certainly Russia is doing a lot of business with India these days, and I know that there's a growing amount of trade outside of the U.S. dollar now that's going on. Even our good friends Canada and Australia, I think New Zealand, have direct ties with China in which they are no longer using the U.S. dollar but trading in their own currencies. I suppose it doesn't matter too much for the dollar's strength whether or not transactions are traded. It's whether people hang on to the dollars for a long period of time. But the one thing that I find very interesting, I know that the U.S. And NATO sort of try to cut Russia off at the knees by taking away their SWIFT trading capabilities to trade internationally, to move money around and so forth, and which I think is really stupid. But again, you talked about how our sanctions are pushing Russia towards China. It seems to me that from what I read, there is also a move towards setting up their own trading infrastructure, their own trading platform, if you will, their own sort of electronic system that would allow them to move and to settle their transactions. Do you see this, the BRICS, forming something that will compete against the United States dollar as the world's reserve currency? And do you see possibly gold playing a role in that in some form?
Well, for several years, the world has many people in the world have realized that we have a problem. That the U.S. dollar is the only world currency, and the dollar is a very flawed currency. America's the largest debtor nation in world history, and the debts are getting higher and higher and higher. So not only do we have a monopoly situation, semi-monopoly situation, but we have a very flawed semi-monopoly situation. So people have been looking for something. This recent development is pushing many countries further and further away from the dollar. Well, they're looking for ways to get away from and avoid the U.S. dollar because of the situation. I mean, if the Russians decide they don't like you, they just, cut you off at the knees. They take all your money away from you, and you can't get it, and you can't move it around. So many people have realized this is not a good situation, and I mean, I don't know who would defend it except maybe some people in Washington. Everybody knows that competitive markets are better than non-competitive markets. So the world is trying to find. Some of the nations have starting to set up competing banks. None of this has taken off in any big way yet, Jay, because it's not that easy.
Yes.
To suddenly change, decades of the way the world has worked.
Sure.
You did mention that some countries have bilateral currency agreements with China. That's spreading more and more. The Chinese economy, the currency is still a blocked currency. It's not freely tradable, but It's becoming much more open and tradable, exchangeable. The last 9 years, they've been taking many steps, and they're almost to complete convertibility now. In some places, they are. They do have complete convertibility. So it's happening, and unfortunately, you and I, as Americans, are going to regret it someday, because eventually something's going to compete with the U.S. dollar, which is going to reduce America's prosperity and power a lot. And eventually something's going to replace the U.S. dollar, which is going to be even worse for America. Mm-hmm. So we're shooting ourselves in the foot yet again by throwing our weight around, saying everybody has to do what we say.
Yeah, and it's I guess that's one of the reasons some of us are buying gold. Warren Buffett is buying a lot of fixed assets, I think railroads and I don't know, agricultural thing. I don't know exactly what he's buying, but from what I understand, a lot of the kinds of things I would picture Jim Rogers buying. While we're on the topic of tangibles, what about commodities now? Are you looking? What is your view on commodities with the Rogers Fund? It's down a lot, like all commodities have gotten hurt. I mean, you think we're still in a secular bull market for commodities, and this was just a cyclical bear within that secular bull?
Well, I obviously don't know any more than anybody else, but I'd remind you with stocks, Jay, between 1982 and 1982 and 2000, there were many big setbacks in the stock market. In
Sure.
1987, stocks went down 40 to 80%. 89, 1990, 1994. I mean, I can go on and on. And every time people said the bull market's over. I don't know that this commodity bull market's over. I happen to think it's not. But we're having a major correction, which is normal in markets. That's the way markets have always worked. I don't see enough permanent supply in most commodities, except maybe iron ore and a couple of others. And iron ore is not publicly traded like the others that I'm interested in. I don't see enough permanent supply unless we're going to have an economic collapse, which we could and will eventually, to end the bull market. I'm especially optimistic about agriculture at the moment. Agriculture has been terrible for 30 years. Agriculture has done nothing for many years. Agriculture today is down from where it was 15 or 20 years ago, believe it or not. So I'm still optimistic about agriculture. We've explained the energy markets, what's happening there. It's a political action that's taking place. Unfortunately, when we bankrupt a few producers, such as the frackers, I'm afraid oil is going to go back much, much higher.
Mm-hmm. Well, you wonder also, there's certainly reports of some of the more marginal companies in the oil patch that are having some difficulty now, and you wonder if that might not set off some sort of a domino or chain reaction. And I guess when the global economy is so highly leveraged, it might not take that much to start things going in the wrong direction. Unfortunately, you would think we would have learned something from 2008, 2009, but I see that the bankers went to Congress or went to Obama and got repeal, or at least part of the Volcker rule repealed, and also, if I understand it, I think they've put it on hold for a couple of years now. So it seems like the bankers get their way no matter what happens, the rich and powerful ones anyway. Would like to just ask you quickly, if I could, Jim, with a couple more minutes that we have left, if I could ask you about Japan. I just listened to Kyle Bass talking about how broke the Japanese government is, with the government paying, I think, 25%, I think he said, on interest expense, 25% of their budget on interest expense, with the average rate that they're paying about 17 basis points only. So, I mean, if you went to 1% even, you would have a huge problem. I mean, you'd be it's and plus the demographics, of course, are horrific for Japan. How do you see that shaking out? What's going to happen there with Japan, and could that be something that sets the whole world spiraling downward to the whole global economy?
Well, I own Japanese shares at the moment. I'll probably buy more, but long term, Japan is a disaster. I mean, they've got declining population, skyrocketing internal debt, debasing the currency. Debasing your currency has never been a viable way to revive a country even in the medium term. It helps in the short term, but it's a disaster in the long term. So Mr. Abe, Prime Minister, is going to go down in history as the person who ruined Japan. No question about that. Totally ruined Japan. In the meantime, I own Japanese shares, and I will probably buy more. He's putting through many things that will have helped and will help the stock market, giving incentives for Japanese to buy shares. He's persuading the pension funds to stop buying government bonds and to buy shares. I mean, he's doing a lot to help the stock market. Again, I want to emphasize that in the end, it's going to be an absolute nightmare and disaster for Japan.
Uh-huh.
But in the meantime, it's good for stockbrokers and financial and I hope for me. Maybe I'm wrong, but
yeah.
I don't own the currency because he is determined to drive it to nothing. But that will also help some parts of the economy, especially the stock market. But in the end, I hate to say it, Jay, there won't be a Japan in 100 years, even maybe in 50 years, because they're not having babies. They're destroying the economy. I mean, it's going to be a disaster. If I were 10-year-old Japanese, I'd move away.
Well, they're just fading away anyway because they're not reproducing, so they're not bringing in immigrants. So, it's a sad story. Do you find, though, that the Japanese stocks are somewhat undervalued in terms of cash flow and profits relative to, say, the U.S. stock market?
Oh, absolutely. The Japanese stock market is down 60% from its all-time high. The U.S. stock market is making all-time high.
Right. Uh-huh.
The Japanese stock market is certainly cheap on a historic basis, on an absolute basis, on a relative basis. You have to be worried about the currency. You have to understand the currency because it is being destroyed. But if you hedge your positions, you might make some money.
Just real quickly on China. China's, by the reports we get here in the West, to the extent you can rely on them, to the extent you can rely on Chinese statistics. I don't know that we can rely on U.S. statistics that much either, but what's your sense of China now? To what extent is it slowing down? Is it transitioning now to a more domestic-dominated economy where there's more domestic demand? Are they making a successful transition in your view?
Well, they have certainly been trying to slow things down. They've had inflation. They've had a property bubble. The government rightly has been trying to slow some things down. Many of their customers are slowing down, as you know, a lot of Europe and et cetera. So, yes, things are changing in China. They have been slowing down. I've been buying Chinese shares for the past year. I did not buy Chinese shares between 2008 and 2013, but the government has come out with a list of the parts of the Chinese economy they're going to emphasize, where they're going to spend billions of dollars emphasizing these parts of the economy. So I've been buying shares in those sectors of the Chinese economy. Other people are going to fail. Real estate will probably collapse. Some financial types will collapse. But in the meantime, I've been buying shares despite the slowdown. I've been buying things, I hope, Jay, in the parts of the economy that are going to do well because the government has decided to emphasize those parts of the economy. There will be some failures, though. There are debt problems in China. There are other kinds of problems in China. Hopefully, I'm buying the right thing.
Well, I'm sure if anybody has done their homework, it's you. And you've, having traveled to various countries, I think also has been a really big help to you, no doubt, in understanding. And I want to thank you very much for sharing your experiences and your wisdom with us. Just one quick thing yet before I let you go. We used to joke, or I don't know, joke. I've always been such a gold bug, and I remember even before you moved from Manhattan, we used to talk about gold. You used to say that lead would outperform gold. I think gold was trading below $500 or so then. But how do you feel about gold versus the other commodities in general now?
Well, I own gold. I own silver. I haven't bought either for a while. I haven't sold any. I did hedge a little bit of my gold. I expect another chance to buy gold and silver, precious metals, in the next year or two. If it happens, then I hope I'm smart enough to buy it. If gold goes under 1,000, Jay, and that's not a prediction, but it could easily. Mm-hmm. If it does go under 1,000, I hope I'm smart enough to buy a lot more. In the meantime, don't get rid of your gold, unless you're a good trader. And if it does go down, but I expect that when the next opportunity comes in a year or two or three, to buy a lot more gold.
Yeah.
If I'm smart enough.
Well, it certainly makes sense, Jim. I think gold should be viewed as a preserver of wealth rather than as an investment vehicle generally. And I know that you've done very well in the past investing, so I always respect your views. But I always remember that you used to tell me all the time, Jay, lead will do better. Well, of course, that was as to the Chinese economy was taking off, and it was a little different then. I think a little more optimistic about the global economy at that time, perhaps, than you were. Certainly than I am right now. But in any event, I want to thank you very much, Jim, for being with us. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I wish you and your family a very Merry Christmas and a really happy and healthy 2015.
Well, happy holidays to you, Jay, and all your listeners. Happy 2015. I hope we do this again.
I would love to. Anytime, James. Thank you so much.